Well, first of all, I'm just going to make some casual remarks, particularly about Colleen Browning's status as a woman artist. And were it not for some wonderful lawyers who've already been mentioned who managed her estate so well, her dedicated husband, Jeffrey Wagner, the art historian, Philip Eliasov, and the director, Gary Moyer, Colleen Browning might have joined the ranks of erased women artists. So instead we have this exhibition and the monograph which will live on, and a museum dedicated to the kind of art she made. And we've just been reminded, of course, of Judy Chicago's feminist monument, The Dinner Party, which was about bringing back to memory women who had been erased. And though on the 39 women featured on the place settings is Georgia O'Keeffe, who really, truthfully, has never been erased. But name some painters, women painters of Georgia O'Keeffe's generation. Name 5, I dare you to. It's very difficult because this is a generation of erased women artists in American art history. I'm showing you now, of course, why Georgia O'Keeffe had such celebrity. She was married to, as many of you know, the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who in the 1920s, photographed her extensively nude and showed those photographs, turning her into a real celebrity. And of course, her own flower paintings. Flowers are reproductive organs. They're sexual by nature. She denied their sexual content, making certainly a frisson just having that discussion. But what about Edward Hopper's wife? She was Edward Hopper's basically only model from the time they married in 1924. And he painted her as herself, rarely. She was standing for many women, and he transformed her. But there in the center image, you see her as Jo painting. She was the artist whom he met in art school. Between 1904 and 1906, they were both students at the New York School of Art. But he shows her so modestly turning away. And that's one of her flower pieces. Colleen Browning also painted still life. Edward Hopper was extremely typical, and for a man of his generation, born in 1882, and he demeaned not only still life painters but lady flower painters, and he saw no reason for women to be artists. And as soon as his wife helped launch his career by getting him into a show at the Brooklyn Museum to which she had been invited, he tried to get her to stop, and he won the Purchase Prize. He tried to get her to stop being an artist, and he kept doing that for the next 43 years of their marriage. But Jo's teacher saw her talent, but he also saw her as a model. The great teacher of American realist, Robert Henry, who had her pose as the art student. She was quite a celebrity in the little art school when she and Edward were both students. And so the dynamics of the marriage matters when a woman artist is married to a male artist. So for O'Keeffe, no one could be better than Stieglitz in terms of promoting your work. He sometimes promoted it much ahead of his own, whereas Edward Hopper would be on a jury and choosing work for an exhibition. Jo would be one of the artists submitting, and she could never get in. That was the last thing he wanted. But Jeffrey Wagner, he somehow managed to leave an estate to promote his wife's art and to inscribe it, as this show and Philip's monograph will do, into history. And by all accounts, they had a very devoted, loving marriage. Supportive. But look, Colleen Browning painted Jeffrey Wagner reading the newspaper. How different is it from the lost painting, which I can only show you in black and white, by Jo Hopper, of her husband Edward reading Robert Frost, his favorite poet. And I can only show these in black and white because these, Jo Hopper, when she died in 1968, less than a year after her husband, she left all of his work and all but one of her paintings to the Whitney Museum of American Art, which chose to give 96 of her best framed works to hospitals where they all have disappeared within a few years, and all the rest of her canvases were discarded, and the watercolors only survived because they were, when I arrived there, had been mistakenly thought to be by Edward. They never show them. This is a challenge. I'd like to see them show them. So all the works you're looking at are now lost, if not destroyed forever. We've seen Jo painted a portrait of her husband, and we've seen that Colleen Browning painted a portrait of her husband. And the closest OKeefe really comes is this view from their window of the Radiator Building, and in red, you can't see it, is Stieglitz's name. So the self-portrait of Colleen Browning we might compare to the self-portrait of Jo Nivison, which miraculously was in a private collection, not in the artist's possession, so you can see it in color because it did in fact survive, and I've got to get a better image. But 1956, Jo bought this special bra so she could pose for Edward, and she has painted herself in it. And there she is after the end of her life with all her paintings, not knowing what to do with them. And this is really a problem for women artists, but one which Jeffrey Wagner and the estate of Colleen Browning have brilliantly solved. And I think Colleen Browning's art, one theme in it, for me at least, is communication. So we see the telephone. She loved to paint people. And just comparing one of her still lifes with the one by Joe Hopper that survives, and the dreamy sky in the painting at the bottom from the 70s, not unlike one. And this is the one Joe Hopper gave to the local library on Cape Cod, one that survives, the one that she didn't leave to the Whitney Museum. And it has that, it's called Odor of Sanctity. It has that imaginary sky as well. And I want to bring up Theresa Bernstein, an artist who lived in 3 centuries, born in 1890, didn't die till 2002. I'm working on a book with my graduate students and an exhibition project now, which will open at our James Gallery at the Graduate Center a year from this November. And Theresa Ferber Bernstein, as far as I know, was the only artist who made and showed her work in every decade of the 20th century. She was so famous, the critics were in the early years, in her 20s and the 19-teens, and in the 1920s, critics were raving about her work. She had so many prizes and shows in New York. She's been almost completely eclipsed. And the critics were writing at the time as a compliment that she painted like a man. She was an absolute realist with slathering paint. That's her self-portrait. A painting of the readers at the New York Public Library. These are large paintings, the size of Colleen Browning's largest paintings, and yet, you know, there is a thing as she lived till 2 weeks short of her 112th birthday, and this is not helpful necessarily for promoting your career. And she made art till she was 110. So this is a prize-winning painting in the Elevated from 1916, and a Polish church Sunday morning from around the same time. And you see a painting now from very late in her career, and it is featuring a portrait of her husband, William Meyerwitz. So when she married in 1919, her career took a dive. Just as Edward Hopper, when he married an artist, his career took off. Just the opposite, and maybe there's a gender issue about marriage. When William died, he said to Theresa, "You must go on," and she took him literally going on for a couple more decades. But what did she do? Every time she would be given a show, she would ask to have his work included, and she wrote a book called William Meyerwitz, The Artist Speaks.